Welcome to Middleweight Politics, political analysis for the independent voter. If you are one of the people who likes their politics in colors other than red and blue, and if you are one of the majority of Americans who does not align with either party, and if you are one of the Americans who feels two parties is too few, welcome home, my purple people. That is what we're about. Now, we have spent a lot of time on this podcast poking fun at the Republican Party because they make it way too easy. But this week, we're going to turn our sights on the Democrats, who have responded to their losses in November with vigorous finger pointing. Is the party going too left, or does it need to swing even leftier? We're going to talk about the fault lines that have emerged between the progressive and centrist wings of the party and what this says about our system on the whole. But first, Shawn, I think it's important that we announce that you have sick kids at home right now, correct?
Oh yeah. Well, not my own kids, not my own kids, but my nephews, my sister's two sons.
Well, first off, I'm glad you clarified the statement of not my own kids with my nephews, because I think that would have raised a ton of questions for the people listening. I went through the same thing. So I have 4 kids total. They're a little older now. But when they were younger, invariably one of them would get sick. And then the question was who was going to fall next. And children kind of serve as a junior college for germs. So what happens is the germs go after them because they've got the weaker immune systems. And then they get a little stronger, and they get a little stronger, and then they get to adult strength. So basically, like once this virus had made it through all my kids, then I was always the last to drop. Mm-hmm. And honestly, if there is anything tougher than trying to care for sick children when you're sick, it's trying to care for well children when you're sick. That makes things very rough. So we're going to have a little noise in the background. Thoughts and prayers, Shawn. That's all I have to say. So let's get into the meat of this conversation, which is around some of the fault lines that have emerged in the Democratic Party. So over the past week, a couple different stories have broken that are revealing the different wings of the Democratic Party and the conflict within those wings, specifically when it comes to who's to blame for the election and also how they're going to proceed in the new Congress. And to set the stage, I think when we talk about America's political system, we're very often oversimplifying it into Democrat or Republican, left versus right. But if you've listened to this podcast, you of course know that it's much more complex than that. And really the way we like to look at the American political system here on Middleweight Politics and how political scientists like to look at it is to look at people on a left-right spectrum when it comes to economic issues, but also a left-right spectrum when it comes to social issues as well. And what we find is that we have people who are socially and economically liberal, socially and economically conservative. Those folks make up the base of the Republican and Democratic parties. But then we have 2 other quadrants there. We have folks who are socially liberal and fiscally conservative. Those are weirdos like you and me, Shawn. Very small portion of the electorate. But the big prize, the quadrant that both parties are fighting over, are the folks that are socially conservative and economically liberal. And those are the folks who swing between parties in each election. And when I look at these stories, Shawn, what I see in a way are those 2 factions at odds with each other.
You know, it's interesting because in the past we've talked about both parties, and we've talked about how the Democratic Party as a whole seems like, as an institution, the stronger of the 2 institutions. However, when someone asked me, well, when you look at the 2 parties, what does the Democratic Party stand for? I honestly couldn't tell you right now. And it's because of this infighting between the centrists and the progressives. It's always got to be a fight of who has dominance within the party. And as a result, the factions that exist within the voter base don't feel represented because the party hasn't defined itself for a while. Really, you could say since Trump came on board as a Republican nominee, they've really failed to define themselves as a party.
Do you know, I would agree with you there. And what I would say, and again, to bring the listener up to speed here, when we talk about the Democratic Party being the stronger party, That means as a party, they do a much better job of enforcing party discipline. They do frankly, a much better job of legislating. And they are much less chaotic when it comes to things like nominating candidates, proposing policy. It's very they're very unified there. Whereas if you look at the Republican caucus, they can be fractured when things come to a vote. Now, on the flip side, the Republicans' platform is far better defined.
Yeah.
And that platform is, Trumpism, right?
Right. And it really seems like the only divide in the Republican Party are those who are opposed to Trump and those who aren't. But again, on an ideological spectrum and from a platform perspective, even the anti-Trump Republicans have the same platform positions as the pro-Trump Republicans. So yeah, when you compare the two sides, it seems the Republicans are more committed to their platform at this point than the Democrats. You have what seems to me to be the old guard trying to maintain control versus the new generation of Democrats who are more progressive and are trying to get into the ranks of leadership.
100%. Well, and I think we saw that this week with Nancy Pelosi, who was lobbying in favor of Jerry Connolly, who's running against AOC for the position of ranking member of the Oversight Committee.
Mm-hmm.
And of course, Pelosi has been critical of AOC and the squad before, both for creating memorable slogans that end up blowing up in the face of the Democrats, such as abolish ICE and defund the police. But she's also been very dismissive of them, saying that they only have influence in the Twitter world and they don't really have any real political power. And of course, the squad has taken objection to that. I think that that battle between establishment and new Democrats is very clear. I don't think that's very new. You do see some, I wouldn't call them new members of the Democratic caucus, but newish members going back and forth. So another great example is Seth Moulton, who was recently chastised for talking about boys playing in girls' sports. And whether you agree with the nature of the conversation, regardless of where you fall on the issue, Moulton's argument was that we should be allowed to debate this as a party. We shouldn't just be shouted down if we bring that up. And I think you could argue it's more democratic, small d democratic, to allow that conversation to take place. I would also say, getting back to the nature of the voters who are going to decide at least presidential elections and decide elections in battleground states, these being the socially conservative, fiscally liberal crowd, the more you're talking about boys playing in girls' sports, the more you're talking about identity issues, the more you're losing those people.
Well, and what's interesting about this is that people like Jon Stewart have brought this up as well, and that is it seems to be that the Republicans have been allowed to define these culture issues as a result of the Democrats' either unwillingness to talk about them at all. Because when we talk about identity politics, when we talk about culture politics, a lot of the narrative came from Republicans in this cycle. It didn't actually come from Democrats. Kamala Harris wasn't talking about transgendered athletes or the bathroom issues, things like that. The Republicans were, and they've been allowed to define those issues. But the difference between the two parties is that at least the Republicans are speaking to these issues, right, as opposed to Democrats. And even as someone like myself who thinks the whole transgender issue is a non-issue, but just the Democrats, particularly from their leadership, just wanting to shut down discussion at all is a problem. And it speaks, in my opinion, to what has been a lingering issue with the Democratic Party, and that is this focus on moral superiority. Even though they aren't speaking to the issue, it does come across like they always want to be the first out to chastise others for bringing these things up.
Yeah, and that's actually what some in the Democratic Party have talked about. Another story that came out this week was Marie Gluesenkamp Perez of Washington. And to set the stage, we've talked about her before. She is from a rural district in Washington. This is a district that Trump carried by a pretty significant margin. She's somebody who outperformed Kamala Harris in that district. And her criticism is that the party has been alienating working class voters through condescension. So they're not focused on issues that affect rural communities. The big one she brought up was fentanyl addiction. The Democratic Party was not speaking enough to those issues in the election. And we've talked about this before. The election was a referendum on Trump.
Yeah.
It was we're better than Trump, which first off is a pretty low bar to set. And secondly, if I don't like the incumbent administration, he's the only other option.
Right.
So it's really weak.
Well, and again, it's another example of just the Democratic Party speaking at people instead of to people. And I know I don't want to focus too much on this particular issue, but I do think it's a good example of, again, this whole idea of the Democratic Party just simply being out of touch because they've spent so much time speaking at people instead of to people. And that is how some Democrats have reacted to the public's response to Brian Thompson's murder. And you had Democrats like Senator Fetterman and Governor Josh Shapiro come out and say that this reaction is wrong. You have a lot of people who have come out in frustration and anger with a system that at all levels has failed the American people, right? A system that has put profit over people's lives. That's how they see it. But instead of these Democrats coming out and speaking to this frustration, this anger, the reason why there's this lack of sympathy that people have seen towards the murder of Brian Thompson, they're saying, no, this is wrong, bad. You shouldn't be having this response to this. And to me, that just, it shows just how out of touch they are, that they're not really speaking to the why people are responding to the way they have.
I mean, yeah, read the room.
Yeah.
Read the room. And I think this is something we've talked about before, but you could even talk about the migrant crisis in that way as well. I think one of the, and I don't remember where I read this, but I heard the Democratic Party described as gaslighting voters on the issue of immigration, basically saying it wasn't a problem. Now, I will speak for myself and my community and also extrapolate on some other communities we've talked about. But here in my town, we've taken in a number of migrants. And right now, there's an entire hotel filled with asylum seekers. And I'm happy they're here. I am glad that they are in my town. I am proud that we're hosting them. But my town, which is not the wealthiest town in the area, is responsible for funding the services for these new arrivals. So when it comes to schools, we need more ESL teachers because these kids don't speak English. We need to pay to bus them back and forth from the hotel to the school. And contractors have jacked up the rates for services because they know it's guaranteed money. So first off, they're bilking the town. But secondly, there's another company that was hired to cater to them, and they're charging an exorbitant amount and serving them like franks and beans. I mean, it's really criminal. And I think what we see is a lack of a coordinated federal response. It's basically like, up here they are, take care of them. And I live in Massachusetts. I told you it's not the wealthiest town, but we're in the Boston area. So relatively speaking, across the country, we are a wealthy community, right? But you go to a place like Springfield, Ohio, for example, where the population has grown, right? And there's a serious impact on the price of housing. There's a serious impact on education. There's a serious impact on services, right? And I think the refusal by the Democratic Party to frame it in terms of the human impact was a failure. And I mean, look, let's be real again. Better than Trump's,
Right.
but still a failure, still a missed opportunity.
Well, and people don't like to be spoken at, right? They like to be spoken to. They like to have a conversation, and they don't want to be told how they should feel, which is essentially what the Democratic Party has done. To briefly go back to the Thompson example, for Shapiro and Fetterman to just diminish it to policy differences. I mean, you're talking about people's lives here. Like, and people are obviously frustrated with the variety of things that have happened within the system that has treated them like they're profit margins and not actual people. And so you can understand the frustration that people have with the Democratic Party, that they're telling people how they should feel rather than speaking to their needs. And I mean, even on economics, which in their platform, that we talked about this in a previous episode, they have policy positions that are very popular. that have over 60% popularity with people. Things like raising the minimum wage, which hasn't been done since 2009, right? But they're not speaking to that. They're just telling people how they should feel about Trump, how they should feel about immigration, and how they should feel about a system that's failing them.
Yeah, exactly. Not speaking to conditions on the ground. And there's a couple of dynamics at play I want to talk about here, but I want to insert a comment by Summer Lee that I think is going to frame everything. So, if you're not aware, Summer Lee is a representative from Pennsylvania, a member of the progressive wing of the Democrats. And she made a very good point about refusing to talk about some of these divisive social issues. And her big thing is that the Democratic Party, in her mind, can't abandon vulnerable constituencies. So the way she's phrased it is that they need to figure out a better way to communicate their stances on social issues without alienating voters, but also not abandoning people for political expediency. And I think you could argue, if you look at the Democratic Party of the 1940s, FDR's coalition, they very much punted on the issue of civil rights.
Mhm.
They very much decided that in the interest of holding the majority, we're just going to allow the Jim Crow regime to continue in the South. And that was a devil's bargain. And so I do hear her there. And I think that this is just another example of how we're trying to cram too many interest groups into too broad of a party, right? Like, the reality is the Democratic Party is not one party. The Republican Party isn't one party. They are a marriage of necessity out of a system that only makes room for two.
And I think when you look at it, and especially when we have this conversation of who should they listen to right now more, and should they be more progressive, should they be more moderate? I don't really know the answer to that question personally, but I do know that when you look at someone like Nancy Pelosi, who's trying to intentionally get in people like AOC's way because she views AOC as someone who just has like Twitter clout and someone who is very popular in social networking, well, that's worked for her. The fact that she's speaking directly to people is working for her. We've talked about in previous episodes how you had Trump voters who also voted for AOC, right? And it's because they are not taking this conventional party leadership approach, this conventional approach that the parties have stuck with for the last 50 years of how to handle their business, and are speaking more directly to people. They have a more personalized relationship with their constituents, it seems like. Even if AOC is not, on a first name basis with her voters, she still has that AOC brand. We refer to her as AOC.
Yeah.
Like, it's a brand.
Yes.
Right. And it's a very personalized, again, just her presence and speaking directly to people is working. And so I think if we're going to have a conversation of what direction the party should go to, maybe not go full progressive as like an AOC, but definitely learn from where her success has been.
I mean, and I'm of the opinion that the current arrangement's untenable. If you look globally, right? If you look globally at democracies, what you will find is that the traditional center left and center right parties have lost ground in the past, let's call it 10, 20 years, right? And what's happened is a number of parties have splintered off that are either further to the left or further to the right. So we've had this situation where the center has had less weight, but it hasn't lost relevance.
Right.
And we talked about this before. We're seeing the same thing here. So we're seeing this political splintering, but it's happening in two parties. And the result is those parties are ineffectual. Those parties can't get anything done. In the case of Democrats, they have a tough time winning a majority due to challenges we can talk about a little later if it makes sense. The Republicans, on the flip side, have the advantage when it comes to elections. They have the advantage in the Senate, they have the advantage in the House, but they can't all get on the same page. And it's due to this fragmenting. And I just feel like we're trying to force these oddball coalitions together. And what we're getting is inaction. What we're getting is this gridlock we see. And even Democratic National Committee announced this week that they were going to determine their party leadership by ranked choice voting, which is really cute. given they opposed it, in Colorado and
in DC, where it was successful. The
yeah.
Democratic Party there actually filed a lawsuit to get it off the ballot.
Yeah. Yeah. And so they're
So,
adopting this method as a way to kind of smooth over these differences. But, I do take Summer Lee's point to heart, which is my issue with standalone ranked choice voting is it will pave over these little micro constituencies
mm,
that really need attention. Because think about it this way, if it weren't for winner take all, the Arab American community wouldn't have the same voice they had in Michigan during this year's presidential election. And to be frank, if it weren't for winner take all, the black community wouldn't have had the voice they had during the civil rights movement. Right? So I'm not advocating winner take all, but what I'm saying is that when you get into a pure ranked choice voting environment and you don't address some of the other issues with the ways the parties control the dialogue, you're going to have a situation where these constituencies are ignored. And to sort of pivot to Seth Moulton's point, just like you can't shout down somebody who questions whether people born male should be participating in girls' sports,
right.
you also can't just drown out the legitimate concerns of marginalized groups. And look, I'm going to say that, and folks on the right are going to hear that, and they're going to be like, well, who cares? But I'll throw another example out there. If you are a conservative Christian, right, watch how pro-life the Republican caucus is in this Congress. Just watch how much they care about the issue, because you're going to find out it's a big donut. 0 votes. So when we talk about marginalized groups, we're not just talking about the traditional pantheon, right? We're not talking about racial minorities. We're not talking about gender minorities. We're talking about people on the right as well. I'm not going to plant a flag in any one of these issues, but what I am going to say is if you're a voter, you have an opinion and you want that opinion to be heard. And in the current paradigm, there's a risk that's not going to happen because somebody doesn't feel it's going to win them elections in the next cycle.
This entire conversation just reminds me of our conversation about Mike Duggan from the last episode, and how when you look at the system right now, how it's putting party politics over what voters need and what communities need, and you see this, and I think the reason why it's so important that we focus on the Democratic Party right now is because you are seeing this put party first right now, at least in my mind, more from the Democrats than you are from the Republicans, because at least you had Trump speaking to people. You agree or disagree with him, and he said a lot of false things on the campaign trail, but he was at least in voters' minds speaking to some of these issues. And so we have a system right now that doesn't encourage more Mike Duggans to emerge and to take a socially liberal position on things like LGBTQIA rights and prioritize people of color and making sure that their rights are protected, but also invite corporate interests to help build that economy again. A very right, very conservative kind of economic policy that he's put in place there. You can't have that melding of positions in a system where, as we talked about last week, he would be considered possibly a more ideal candidate for the general election. But because he could not get past the primary, he would never make it to the general election.
Yeah.
So we have this very party centric, party focused system that puts their interest above what actually can serve communities and serve people.
100%. And I think if you go back to Gluesenkamp Perez in Washington, and again, we've talked about this to death, the nonpartisan open primary system that's in use in Washington, that's in use in California, really encourages and works to the advantage of those who really know their constituencies. And so I would say that if we want to encourage a diversity of voices, and we also want representatives who are really in touch with their constituents, nonpartisan open primaries are certainly a good solution. I think it doesn't come without its drawbacks. And to be frank, I think that system still creates some barriers to real political innovation. It forces reps to be in touch with their constituents, but again, you still have that issue of certain marginalized constituencies not having a voice. I mean, My wave of magic wand solution is always going to be mixed member proportional representation. It allows for multiple parties, allows for more fluidity. I think top 4 is a good second choice if I'm ranking my reforms in order of preference, Shawn. I think the top 4 system they're using in Alaska is my second choice. I think that would at least allow candidates with alternate positions to be heard and for new positions to be adopted.
I think right now it's difficult because I think there's definitely a conversation that people should have about multi-member proportional representation. Just saying that in a sentence is very long, but there is a conversation that needs to be had. I think when you talk about solutions and what actually is going to get through, that's the most difficult. It might be the most ideal solution, but it's also the most difficult to get past because of a number of barriers that would be in place for getting it through, not the least of which are the 2 major parties who would vehemently oppose it, just like they do with nonpartisan primaries and ranked choice voting, as they did in Alaska. I think right now, when we look at the most tenable and the most achievable goals, and I think you're seeing this with reformers as well, they see that the nonpartisan winner nonpartisan primaries, the top 4s, top 5s, there is a path to success. Yeah, there were setbacks, there were losses this election, but the fact that it's already passed in a state in Alaska, which prior to reform was considered an extremely red state, but now you have this election system that doesn't cater to the extremes, but rather incentivizes a more broader approach to voters for the candidates, and so you're not seeing the more extreme candidates win. For reformers, this is right now the path to better elections.
And I think to springboard off what Gluesenkamp Perez has said and what she's done, it's got to start local. Whatever it is you want to do has to start locally. There's a well-organized proportional representation organization in California. There are folks looking to implement ranked choice voting nationwide. There are folks looking to implement top 4. So if you're hearing this is not passive information. This is a call to action. Find that org, get involved. And I think, Shawn, we're going to cap it off there. You've got sick kids at home, not your own, but related. Thank you very much for listening to Middleweight Politics. If you like this episode, please rate it, please leave it a review, and please share it with anybody else you think might need to hear this. The theme music you're hearing is courtesy of the U.S. Coast Guard Band. Thank you again for listening. We will be back. Why can't I say this? We will be back next week. That only took like 8 takes. Stay purple.